On a bustling naval dock under the gray dawn sky, a decorated veteran stood ready to board a ship for a ceremonial voyage, only to be stopped cold by a young lieutenant's rigid command. The veteran's years of service meant nothing in that moment, until an admiral's unexpected arrival turned the tide, demanding his return with a single, unwavering order. The morning was crisp, the air heavy with the salt of the sea. As James Jim Callahan stood at the edge of the pier, his weathered sea bag slung over one shoulder. At 62, Callahan was no stranger to naval protocol. His 30 years of service, including 2 decades as a chief petty officer, had etched lines of experience into his face and a quiet confidence into his bearing. He'd been invited to join the USS Constellation for a commemorative voyage honoring veterans of the Gulf War, a conflict where he'd earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. This was no ordinary trip. It was a chance to reconnect with the Navy he loved, to stand on a deck once more, and to share stories with a new generation of sailors. Callahan adjusted his cap, the faded emblem of his old unit barely visible, and stepped toward the gangway. The Constellation loomed ahead, its gray hull gleaming under the early light. Sailors bustled around him, their movements precise, their voices clipped with the urgency of pre-departure checks. He felt a surge of pride watching them, remembering his own days of endless drills and camaraderie. This was his world, or at least it had been. As he approached the gangway, a young officer stepped forward, his lieutenant's bars glinting on his collar. Lieutenant Daniel Harper was in his late 20s, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture rigid. Harper's eyes scanned Callahan, lingering on the civilian clothes and the absence of active duty insignia. Name and purpose? Harper asked, his tone clipped, official. James Callahan, he replied, his voice steady but warm. I'm here for the Veterans Commemorative Voyage. Got my invitation. An ID right here. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a neatly folded letter from the Navy's Public Affairs Office and his veteran's ID card. Harper took the documents, his brow furrowing as he skimmed them. The letter was clear. Callahan was an honored guest, invited by Rear Admiral Thomas Grayson himself to join the voyage. The ID confirmed his status as a retired chief petty officer with a distinguished service record. But Harper's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. This doesn't check out, Harper said, handing the papers back. The guest list was finalized yesterday, and I don't have you on it. You'll need to step aside. Callahan blinked, caught off guard. There must be a mistake, Lieutenant. The invitation came straight from Admiral Grayson's office. I spoke with the staff last week to confirm. Harper's jaw tightened. I don't know anything about that. My orders are clear the gangway for authorized personnel only. You're not on the list, sir. The sir was polite, but carried an edge, a reminder of authority. Callahan felt a flicker of frustration, but kept his composure. He'd dealt with overzealous officers before, young ones eager to prove their mettle. I understand you're following protocol, he said calmly, but I've got the documentation. If you check with the Admiral's office, I'm sure this can be cleared up. Harper didn't budge. I don't have time to chase down every discrepancy. We're on a tight schedule, and the ship departs in 30 minutes. Step aside, please. The words hit Callahan like a cold wave. He'd spent decades following orders, giving them, and navigating the Navy's labyrinth of bureaucracy. He knew the importance of protocol, but this felt different, personal, almost. Around him, other veterans and active duty sailors were boarding without issue, their credentials barely glanced at. Callahan noticed a few familiar faces, men he'd served with years ago, now climbing the gangway with nods of recognition in his direction. Yet here he was, rooted to the pier, blocked by a lieutenant who seemed determined to make a point. Lieutenant, Callahan tried again, his voice firmer. I'm not here to cause trouble. I was invited to honor the service of men like me who fought in the Gulf. I'd appreciate it if you'd verify my status. Harper's eyes narrowed. I've got my orders, and I'm not calling the Admiral's office for every veteran who shows up with a letter. You're holding up the line. Move, or I'll have security escort you off the pier. The threat stung. Callahan's hand tightened around the strap of his sea bag. He wasn't one to pull rank or boast about his service, but the dismissal burned. He'd faced enemy fire, saved lives, and mentored countless sailors. Now, He was being treated like an outsider on a dock he'd walked 1,000 times. Before he could respond, a petty officer nearby, who'd overheard the exchange, stepped closer. "Lieutenant Harper," the petty officer said cautiously, "I know Chief Callahan. He's legit. Served with my old CO in Desert Storm. Maybe we should check." "I don't need your input, petty officer," Harper snapped, cutting him off. "Back to your post." The petty officer hesitated, then retreated, casting an apologetic glance at Callahan. The veteran stood there, weighing his options. He could argue further, but Harper's rigidity suggested that would go nowhere. He could leave, but that meant abandoning the chance to honor his service and reconnect with the Navy he'd given his life to. Or he could wait, hoping someone higher up would intervene. As Callahan stepped back, his eyes scanned the pier. The crowd was thinning as the final boarding calls echoed. He noticed a small group of officers approaching from the far end of the dock, their uniforms adorned with a kind of insignia that demanded attention. At the center was Rear Admiral Thomas Grayson, a tall, silver-haired man whose presence carried the weight of decades at sea. Grayson was known for his fairness, his no-nonsense leadership, and his deep respect for those who'd served under him. Callahan's heart lifted slightly. If anyone could resolve this, it was Grayson. The Admiral had personally signed the invitation, after all. Callahan had met him once, years ago, during a ceremony honoring Gulf War veterans. Grayson had shaken his hand, thanked him for his service, and spoken briefly about the importance of remembering those who'd fought. As Grayson and his entourage drew closer, Callahan stepped forward, intending to catch his attention. But Harper was quicker. "Admiral, sir," Harper called out, snapping to attention. "We're finalizing boarding now. Everything's in order." Grayson's eyes swept the scene, landing briefly on Callahan. There was a flicker of recognition, though Callahan couldn't be sure. "Good," Grayson said, his voice deep and measured. "Any issues?" Harper hesitated, then gestured toward Callahan. "Just one, sir. This individual claims to be a guest, but isn't on the manifest. I've asked him to step aside." Grayson's gaze settled on Callahan, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" he said, stepping closer. "Let me see your documents." Callahan handed over the invitation, an ID, his hand steady despite the tension. Grayson took them, his eyes scanning the letter with the same intensity he'd once used to read battle reports. The pier seemed to quiet, all eyes on the Admiral as he reviewed the papers. "This is my signature," Grayson said finally, his tone flat but firm. He looked at Harper. "Why is this man not boarding?" Harper straightened, his confidence faltering. "Sir, he's now on the finalized guest list. I was following protocol to ensure only authorized personnel." "Protocol?" Grayson interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "This man's a decorated veteran with a direct invitation from my office. You think I signed those for just anyone, Lieutenant?" Harper's face reddened. "No, sir. You just decided to override my orders?" Grayson's eyes didn't leave Harper's. "You think you know better than the chain of command?" The lieutenant opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling for words. Callahan stood silently, watching the exchange. He didn't want Harper humiliated, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the Admiral step in. Grayson handed the documents back to Callahan. "Chief," he said, his tone softening, "you're boarding this ship. That's an order." He turned to Harper. "And you, Lieutenant, will personally ensure Mr. Callahan is settled on board. You'll also report to my office after this voyage to discuss your understanding of protocol." "Yes, sir," Harper said, his voice tight. He saluted, though his hand trembled slightly. Grayson nodded to Callahan. "Welcome aboard, Chief. We're honored to have you." With that, he turned and continued down the pier, his entourage following. Callahan exhaled, the weight of the moment lifting. He glanced at Harper, who was now motioning stiffly toward the gangway. "This way, sir," Harper said, his earlier bravado gone. As Callahan climbed the gangway, the deck of the Constellation stretched out before him, a familiar expanse of steel and purpose. He felt the ship's gentle sway beneath his feet, the hum of its engines vibrating through the hull. Sailors moved around him, some offering nods of respect, others unaware of the drama that had unfolded on the pier. Callahan didn't need their recognition. He was here, back on a Navy ship where he belonged. Harper, trailing behind, said nothing. Callahan could sense the lieutenant's discomfort, but he chose not to dwell on it. The kid had made a mistake. Overzealous, maybe, but not malicious. Callahan had seen worse in his years of service. He'd been that young officer once, eager to prove himself, sometimes at the expense of judgment. On deck, Callahan was greeted by a commander who'd been expecting him. Chief Callahan, the commander said, extending a hand. Heard a lot about you. Glad you made it. Thanks, Callahan replied, shaking the hand. Just happy to be here. The commander led him to a small group of veterans already gathered near the ship's bridge. They were older men like him, their faces marked by time and service. They swapped stories of past deployments, of storms weathered and battles fought. Callahan felt the years slip away, the camaraderie as strong as ever. As the ship cast off, its horn blaring across the harbor, Callahan stood at the railing, watching the pier recede. The incident with Harper faded into the background, overshadowed by the familiar rhythm of the sea. He thought about Grayson's intervention, the Admiral's unwavering authority. It wasn't just about getting him on board. It was about respect, about honoring the service of those who'd come before. Harper, meanwhile, stood at his post, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd been humbled, but Callahan suspected the lesson would stick. The Navy had a way of teaching its own, sometimes harshly, sometimes kindly. For Callahan, it was enough to be here, on this ship, with the wind in his face and the Navy's heartbeat beneath his feet. The voyage lasted 3 days, a journey through coastal waters that gave the veterans a chance to relive their past while sharing it with the active duty crew. Callahan spoke at a small ceremony on the 2nd day, recounting a mission in the Gulf where his quick thinking had saved a stranded patrol. The younger sailors listened intently, some asking questions, others simply absorbing the weight of his words. Harper was there, too, standing at the back of the group. Callahan caught his eye once, offering a slight nod. The lieutenant nodded back, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. It was a small moment, but it mattered. When the Constellation returned to port, Callahan was among the last to disembark. He thanked the crew, shook hands with the commander, and stepped onto the pier with a sense of closure. The Navy had changed since his day, new ships, new faces, new challenges. But its core remained: duty, honor, respect. Grayson's intervention had reminded him of that, and Harper's mistake had shown how those values were passed down, sometimes through hard lessons. As he walked away, sea bag over his shoulder, Callahan felt the weight of his years of service settle comfortably within him. He'd been tested, not by enemy fire this time, but by a moment of misunderstanding. And the Navy, as it always had, found a way to set things right.